Welcome to WagerTalk TV. I'm Kelly Stewart, at Kelly in Vegas on Twitter, joined by the man himself, Mr. Bruce Marshall. What a treat to have him in studio today. If you guys are not giving Bruce a follow, at Bruce A. Marshall on Twitter. Bruce, for anybody that's been living under a rock, let's give a little bio about yourself over the last basically 50 years in this sports betting industry.
Yeah, well, we'll get back to 1969 in just a minute. I started at the Gold Sheet in 1981, and I was still one of the babies at the Gold Sheet. So I like to say it was like a Supreme Court appointment when you worked at the Gold Sheet. But we're now part of the WagerTalk family, so this is very exciting for us. But the Gold Sheet's going to still look the same. We'll be talking about it more in videos as we go forward here, but it's still going to look the same this year, the same stuff you've all been used to for, this will be our 63rd year publishing the Gold Sheet. First season was 63rd season, 1957 was the first year. But we've been around, but we're still kicking.
Incredible stuff,
yeah.
Giving everybody all the help, including myself, when I don't have time to find those little tidbits on the games. Okay, but Bruce is actually here to talk about NFL preseason. Now, this is something I've said before on the show. I hated preseason. Why? Because I didn't understand how to handicap it. I joined the WagerTalk family. I had some of the guys say, hey, Kelly, look, here's a little bit of help. And now all of a sudden I'm like, yes, Hall of Fame game, catch that under. And I'm so excited for the rest of these preseason videos. So I'll let you start off. You have a little history lesson for us.
Yeah, I mean, preseason football was a much bigger deal in the old days than people believe now. When I tell them what a major storyline preseason was in the late 60s, especially after the Super Bowl era began, the AFL-NFL rivalry really burned its brightest, not necessarily in those first four Super Bowls, but in the preseasons of 67, 68, and 69. It was a very big deal. And in that era, these teams really tried to win in preseason. They were all playing 6.
You mean teams actually tried to win?
They tried to win, and starters were in there. Now, it was a different era. I mean, players were playing to get into shape in summer, so they almost had to play. So we understand that, different from today. But it was very big stuff and big news stuff. 1967, when the Chiefs beat the Bears 66-24, was a major story in Sports Illustrated that week. The biggest preseason game and one of the biggest football games that I ever recall hype-wise was the 1969 Jets-Giants game at the Yale Bowl. Now, the Jets had just come off the Super Bowl, and people who weren't around in 69 don't realize what a big deal Joe Namath was after that Super Bowl. In fact, he had to retire for a short period of time, the Bachelor's 3 thing. We'll talk about that later. But by the time preseason began, he was back in the fold. They hyped up this Jets-Giants game so much. The Giants had yet to play an AFL team in the preseason. They played this game at the Yale Bowl, 74 miles from New York. So that was within the blackout radius of 75 miles. No live TV in New York. They would put these games on delay. It was such a big deal, though. Let me tell you, it was going on August 17th of 69. That was the last day of Woodstock. So you had blood, sweat, and tears, and you had Johnny Winter and Alvin Lee came on later that night, and it carried on to the next morning. So that was going on. Hurricane Camilla, huge, the biggest storm maybe of the 60s, was happening that weekend. You just were a month after the moon landing. Chappaquiddick had just happened. There were a lot of things in the news. Philip Bleiberg, the longest surviving heart transplant patient, died that weekend. So there's a lot of big news. In New York, though, the first story that night on the news was Jets-Giants at the Yale Bowl, 37-14 Jets. Maybe it was Joe Namath's last great game, but he was in there firing away. He said after the game, when did you know you had this game? He said the first time we had the ball. It was so hyped. I'll tell you how important it was. Allie Sherman, the Giants coach, was fired a couple of weeks later. The Giants ended up losing all their preseason games that year, but mainly because of that Jets embarrassment. And the Giants were NFL aristocracy in those days. To lose that game big like that, really.
Total embarrassment.
Embarrassment, and that had a lot to do with Sherman getting fired right before the regular season began and Alex Webster took over. So it was a huge deal.
Yeah, I can't imagine a coach getting fired in the preseason now.
Yeah, and can you imagine it being Sports Illustrated covering it, first story, New York, all the papers, the news TV stations that night, that was the first story. So it used to be a big deal. So I kind of miss those days, but it doesn't mean there aren't some handicapping edges we can still find in this different era.
That's great, you guys. Football. History lessons from Bruce Marshall. Who would have ever thought a coach got fired in the preseason? Okay, so I know you have a couple trends you're going to go over, and then we'll talk a little bit about handicapping the preseason.
Yeah, I mean, there's some team trends that you want to look at here in the preseason, and you know, it doesn't matter that it's a lot different than the regular season. August sort of lives by itself in the preseason. And you handicap it a little bit differently, but there are some trends that have happened in preseason that have gone on and endured for several years that you want to look at. Mainly to do with coaches. Some of these guys take these games a lot more seriously than others. Obviously, I mean, you mentioned the Atlanta-Denver game last week in the Hall of Fame game. Well, Dan Quinn, the Falcons coach, is one of these guys who really downplays the preseason. He's now lost all 9 preseason games dating back 2 years, and he's failed to cover the spread 11 in a row. I mean, he doesn't put much of a premium on these games. One team that does is Baltimore, though. In fact, the Ravens are the Patriots of August. John Harbaugh's won 13 straight preseason games dating back 3+ years, and only 1 non-cover versus the spread there. And that was the Hall of Fame game last year when the Bears scored in the last second to get inside the number. They're the Patriots of August. The Patriots of August are not the Patriots we know. I mean, Bill Belichick's basically a 500 coach in the preseason.
He doesn't really care. And he's kind of made that known.
Yeah, so, I mean, you just kind of throw all that out and you handicap August differently, and you kind of look at the coaches who've been prioritizing winning or not winning, and a working knowledge of the roster is good too, especially if you have an idea about the backup quarterbacks. If they can move the team a little bit, that's a big plus. Who could forget when Russell Wilson showed up in Seattle back in 2012? He was coming in behind Matt Quinn at the start, and Pete Carroll would use him, and Wilson came in and blew the doors off of everybody, and it made Seattle quite a place. Certainly that year, Wilson's first year, which was 2012, and then he kept, Carroll had a great preseason record for many years. So there's certain coaches and certain teams that take these seriously, know the roster, know the series, know the coach's history in preseason, and you can find some angles that work in August, I think.
Lots and lots of great information there from Bruce. Guys, $2 Tuesday, every single Tuesday, you get the hottest handicappers best bet for just $2 at both WagerTalk and our sister site, sportsmemo.com.